Working undercover is doing a magic trick for someone who doesn't know they're on a stage. In the halls of the Bureau, Martin is the OG undercover. He's the only FBI agent to ever infiltrate a Colombian drug cartel.
I can't imagine doing something like that or putting my family in that position. Or
finds out that Martin is actually an FBI agent, and he sends a Sicario to his house to kill him.
Well, what do you do with the money that you seize? Oh, you keep funding undercover operations. You make it work against the guys that earned it.
This is how you launder money if you are a drug lord.
Asking real questions, getting real answers, talking to people who know what they're talking about. It's Talking Better Expert with Marty Skovlund Jr.
All right, Ian Frisch.
Hey.
I'm saying the last name right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. I'm excited today. You're the author of Inside the Cartel. Hopefully that's showing up in frame right now. How an undercover FBI agent smuggled cocaine, laundered cash, and dismantled a Colombian narco-empire. I'm insanely interested in the kind of contents of this book, and we should maybe introduce you a little bit here. You're a journalist and author of 2 different books, this being the second, right?
Mm-hmm.
A television producer whose work has been published in... I am messing this completely up. You're a television producer. You've made TV shows before. You've been an executive producer.
Mm-hmm.
Your work as a journalist has been published in places like the New York Times, Esquire, Playboy, Wired, and Vice, among many others. But we're here to talk about the book today, and I can't wait to jump into this.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you are writing this. You're the co-author of this book, right? You worked with Martin Suarez, who's a undercover FBI agent for years. How did you guys meet? Typically guys that are in the undercover FBI business aren't searching out journalists very often, at least, I guess, unless they're looking to write a book. But how did you guys get linked up?
So Martin retired from the FBI in 2011. And ever since he retired, all of his colleagues had been harping on him to write a memoir because in the halls of the Bureau, Martin is the OG undercover. He's up there with Donnie Brasco. Martin kind of wrote the rule book a little bit in the 80s and 90s, and he translated a lot of what he learned on the fly into national protocol for other undercovers. He became a coordinator in the covert space. So he retires in 2011. All the other undercovers and case agents who worked with him were like, Martin, you got to write your book. You got to tell your story. You're the only guy who's ever infiltrated a cartel. You taught us everything we know. Martin's a pretty humble guy. But around the pandemic, Martin started having these sort of strange physical symptoms, and he was subsequently diagnosed with ALS. Kind of a shock diagnosis for someone who was in the Navy, who worked undercover, who lived on boats, who could fly planes, who was a very active sort of person. And I think that for Martin, he knew his future was uncertain, and he kind of figured he might have only one shot to tell his story.
Mm-hmm.
He was good friends with Bob Whitman. Bob Whitman was an undercover agent who worked primarily in art theft and art recovery. He wrote a book about 12, 13 years ago about his experiences working undercover and retrieving stolen art. And his agent was Larry Weissman, who was our agent.
I was going to say, I've heard of this guy before.
So Bob called Larry, was like, I got a guy. I got the guy. Right? This guy is the legend that no one has heard of before, Martin Suarez. So Martin and Larry chat. Martin tells him the basic contours of his career. Then Larry calls me. He said, it's been a bit since your first book. Your first book was your own memoir. You kind of have a feel of the form. And what do you think about writing Martin's memoir? And I'm like, well, who's Martin? Like, what's the hook here? He was like, he's the only FBI agent to ever infiltrate a Colombian drug cartel. I said, okay, I'm listening.
Yeah.
So then I chat with Martin, and, he has a very long and very interesting career, 23 years working undercover. And he was telling me a lot about his career, kind of big picture. But I was really interested in the cartel stuff because, again, he's the only one to ever do it. There's a sense of nostalgia, a renewed sense of nostalgia regarding cartels right now. There's a lot of things that make this book a why now book, even though the core narrative took place over 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, you bring up his diagnosis with ALS. That is something near and dear to my heart. My dad, my aunt, my uncle, my grandma, my dad's cousin, they've all died of ALS.
Wow.
It's uniquely affected my family. And you said it's kind of surprising that he is such an active guy. It's actually, Martin he was in the Navy for 8 years. He was a surface warfare officer.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. A lot of people don't know this, but the military veterans are uniquely affected by ALS. They're disproportionately affected by ALS. And so it's a real problem. I hate that he's going through that.
Yeah.
I hate that that's the thing that pushed him into telling a story, because these are important stories to tell. These are stories that inspire the next generation of undercover agents, of federal law enforcement, of all sorts of different people that want to go out there and do good in the world. And so I hate that it came to that, but I'm glad that he is telling his story.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, foreign military are acutely affected, because he kind of blames it on the fire retardant foam they used in the Navy. He said, we used to do drills where we sprayed that shit in the hulls and there's no ventilation, and you have to prepare for a fire on a ship.
Yep.
Because if there's a fire on a ship, like, you're screwed. So he was saying, he was like, I bet it was that stuff, because that stuff was nasty. And they were spraying this shit in the late 70s, early 80s. Like, they didn't have the PPE that they do now. They don't have like the chemical knowledge that they do now.
Yeah.
So to your point, and it does suck. And certainly it made the collaborative process a little bit difficult, because it affects his voice.
Yep.
And it affects his tongue. And so when him and I were collaborating on the book, a high degree of patience was required. But once we got kind of past the first two questions I always ask when I want to write a story, and these two questions are very important, and I ask them to Martin, and I ask them to myself when I write any story, is where does the story begin and where does the story end? Because we ain't writing a book that covers 23 years.
Yep.
I said, we need to find a place that starts with heightened tension and ends with heightened tension. And that's how we kind of settled on a 6-year period between 1988, when he became an FBI agent, and then 1994, when arguably his most monumental case was adjudicated and closed.
Yeah, and you certainly do start it off with a bang. It's, we'll get into that, but I think, before we get there, you mentioned Donnie Brasco, and that, like, I think his name's Joe
Pistone.
Joe Pistone. Yeah.
Joe Pistone.
So in researching and reporting this book, did you look at a lot of Joe's experiences as an undercover FBI agent who's kind of groundbreaking in his own right, in his own era? And did that help inform the type of questions that you asked Martin, and the type of, I guess, plot points that you wanted to put in, or how you constructed your story?
Yeah, and it was kind of a multifaceted approach to how to write this book, starting with where does it start and where does it end? Pretty simple, right? But to that point, you have to understand that when you're writing a memoir for someone else, you have to really understand their point of view. And when you're working undercover, you have 2 points of view simultaneously.
Yes.
You have your character, and then you have you. So it was a dance almost, in terms of coming to Martin and trying to understand you are operating in a way to deceive another person, while also having your own internal monologue as Martin. There is Manny, your undercover alter ego, and then there's you. How can we translate that duality onto the page in a way that is compelling and makes sense to the reader, so they understand almost on a philosophical level what going undercover kind of means? Now, I wanted to see how other people did it. I read Donnie Brasco twice. I read, again, Bob Whitman's book. I read all the undercover books. I really wanted to see how they structured them, how they balanced that duality, how they gave operational details that are kind of fun and tradecrafty, and then how they got into the emotional side of what it means to be a federal law enforcement officer, not to mention one that works undercover. And that's a huge part of the book too, is I had to keep asking Martin, how did it make you feel right? And
Yeah.
that was such a huge part of this book because I wanted it to transcend genre. I didn't want it to be a look at me, I'm an undercover agent. Look how
Yeah.
cool I am. You know, I
Yeah.
wanted it to feel like this was written by a real person, by a man who had internal conflict, by a man who wanted to do right by his country, but also by his family and what that really took.
Yep.
And then you just have like just the batshit crazy nature of just what he did to try to make this case on an operational level. So the book for me was a kind of balancing act, a sense of searching for equilibrium between all of these things and going back too into some of the best kind of stories of undercover agents like Donnie Brasco and kind of mining details. But again, Donnie Brasco was really the only undercover memoir that really tracked one case. A lot of the other ones were kind of anthology series of multiple cases.
Like you said, Martin had 23 years undercover. So it's like you could do, section 1 is my time with the cartel. Section 2 is my time with the, whatever other organization. But to your point, it's so much more interesting and a more compelling read when you're not getting just the brief overview of all these, no author wants to write the Wikipedia entry of books.
Well, also too, you have to understand that undercover work, it's not something that is just kind of, you snap your fingers and it happens. An undercover agent who goes deep undercover and is able to truly infiltrate a community of criminals their success is due in part to their own skill, but so much of things that they can't control, your ethnicity, your background, the skills you brought to the job, all of these things are kind of almost by luck or happenstance.
Yeah.
And it's also timing. When Joe Pistone went undercover as a mobster, you're at the height of the mafia. Similarly, when Martin became an FBI agent, he was the perfect age, his early 30s, and it was the late 1980s, the height of the war on drugs. He was one of the only dudes who was a native Spanish speaker from Puerto Rico, had street smarts, could chart a ship, fly a plane, talk the talk, walk the walk, and had balls of steel. So it was like perfect place, perfect time. If Martin was who he was, but he joined in 2003, he probably wouldn't have had that opportunity because they wanted people who could integrate more so into Arabic speaking circles, Muslim communities. It's all about what's going on way at the top too. So for Martin, it was just a perfect storm of factors that gave him this opportunity. And I wanted to make that clear as well in the book. So coming into the book, it was a little bit of everything. And also too, how can we make sure that when someone's reading it, they want to turn the page? Classic storytelling stuff. I don't want to get too caught up in the details. I want to just make sure that on a fundamental level, this is a kick-ass story that people are going to enjoy.
I want to make sure this book is setting up here because this is such a, when you talk about the nostalgia of the era, it like you accomplish that just with the book cover here. It's hot pink. It's not, it screams 90s. You think Miami Vice, like.
So when we were doing the cover, right, like there's so much, like you think of like a cheesy ass like law enforcement book cover, and I'm like, yeah, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
I said, we want pink, we want yellow. I was like, I want this book cover to scream. That was how I said to the publisher. That's exactly what I said. I was like, this thing's got to scream. This has to be a 15-footer, which means that when you walk in the bookstore, you see it from 15 feet away. And I mean, I was thrilled at what we came out with because like this is exactly what I wanted.
I want like the t-shirt of this. Like I don't know if you're considering doing merch for the book launch, but like I will wear this t-shirt.
Yeah, it's pretty sick.
This is so cool.
And this is Martin in the middle.
Yeah.
This was a surveillance image. I do have the original, which is a black and white photo. Martin was able to obtain a couple images from the case file, of which there were probably thousands, but he had a couple good ones. This one was probably the best. And these two dudes are traffickers for the Medellin cartel. This shorter guy over here was kind of like a lead smuggler, and this was his kind of muscle man, his Sicario. So this guy would help with logistics, but if anyone ever needed to get whacked, this guy would do the dirty work. But Martin in this picture is negotiating a cocaine shipment with them. I think that's from 89, maybe.
Wow. So early on into his time undercover
in Miami,
Yeah.
because the first chunk of time was working in Miami as a smuggler, and that's how he was really first integrated into the cartel, was as someone who could source a ship and get your drugs from Colombia to Miami undetected.
It's almost like getting hired at any other company. Is like the company has to have a gap. You know, you have to be able to fill that gap. You know, like you have a particular set of skills, you know, to quote my man Liam Neeson. And it's not like you just go in and submit your application at a cartel and say, hey, I'd like to work for you. You know, it's like you have to come from a background and bring something to the table that's useful to them.
Well, and that's, you know, and that was really why Martin was able to integrate so quickly and so thoroughly. But one of the main reasons why he was able to get started was that they had a source. The FBI, the Miami field office, had convinced a pilot for the Medellin cartel to become what they call a cooperating witness or a source. Basically, this person works kind of undercover in their own capacity as a criminal, where you're working with the feds. And in Martin's case, this guy's main job was to introduce Martin to his cartel brethren and say, oh, this is my old buddy Manny. I haven't seen him in so long, but, you know, he's back on the water and he's super talented and he has a warehouse in Miami and he has all the operational things that we need. We should work with him. And that was really how Martin got started. He wasn't like walking down the street and being like, yo, you cartel, you know, this stuff was like really well set up from the highest levels. And that's how Martin was even asked to see if he wanted to even do undercover, because they had isolated this source. So when they had the source, they're like, how can we maximize the benefit of this person? This person's not some street level dealer, because back then the FBI, you know, under Louis Freeh and in like the Reagan era, they kind of realized that drugs weren't their problem. It wasn't the actual drugs. It was the people. It was the operational structures that the cartels had mastered that allowed them to get the drugs into the United States. Once the drugs hit the streets, like, it wasn't the FBI's problem per se. They were really focused on the people. I mean, once the drugs hit communities, it was local police, it was state police, it was even DEA doing a lot of like stateside distribution networks, tracking that sort of thing. The FBI wanted to get the guys who were operating on both sides of the Caribbean. They're going to Colombia, they're coming to Miami, or they're going back and forth. They're the ones communicating with the deputies in the cartel. They're the ones coordinating the stateside distributors. If they could break that chain, then they would have you know, you get so much more bang for your buck in terms of, you know, operational return. And that's why they asked Martin, because he was the only guy in Miami at the time who could kind of fit the bill. So when Martin said, sure, I'll go undercover, he had just joined the FBI a few months prior, working on a drug squad in Miami, tracking people and doing similar things. But when he went undercover, he was able to go up the chain pretty quick. And they basically said, all right, you're going to meet with this guy, Diego, and he's going to show you the ropes. And he gave him all the tips. And he said, you know, when you go to a restaurant with these guys, you know, and they're over ordering and they're ordering liquor, you know, and you want to foot the bill, like, don't check the bill. Like, don't look at the bill. Drug lords don't look at the bill. They don't ask the manager about, well, what's this? You know, like, and never wear resold shoes. You know, like if a drug lord sees you and you don't have brand new shoes on, they know you're a cop. Like, these guys aren't stupid, you know, and this source kind of taught Martin all the little things that would keep your cover intact.
So this is interesting, because one of the things that I was thinking about is like, yes, he grew up in Puerto Rico. Yes, he was a Spanish speaker, all these things. But again, I think about, he was also a naval officer, you know, a United States naval officer, like that. They have a certain way about them. They're very polished people, you know, naval officers, much more than I'd say even other branches. There's a certain aura to them. And to think that a guy that was that could then go fit in with cartel like drug gang life and be believed to the point that he's did it as long as he did and got as high as he did. It's kind of insane to think about. I mean, those are two very different personalities.
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that, because I kind of feel like he used the professionalism taught to him by the Navy as a tool to convince the higher end cartel dudes that he was like legit, like he had his shit together. And again, it's kind of like when you think about drug cartels, you think of these sort of like unwieldy, kind of trigger happy, almost street guys, right? But like when you get up, especially in the Colombian cartels, they're really quite polished and well educated. And if you can come across as with an element of restraint and professionalism, and you have your rules, and you don't break from best practices, it's like all the things he was taught in the Navy and the FBI actually kind of helped him in that way, while sprinkling in a little bit of that, street fairy dust that he collected along the way too.
No, it's a really good point. And, you think about how big the cartels were then. And I think there's some interesting statistics out even now, but then they were very large. I don't have the exact statistic in front of me, but I just remember some of the press that came out when the Netflix show Narcos was coming out, which was the first season started off with the Medellin cartel, right? Pablo Escobar, all that sort of stuff. And I believe it was either in the show or some of the press around the show that they talked about, if the Medellin cartel was publicly listed, they'd be a Fortune 50 company back then. Like, these were insanely big businesses. And because they weren't above board, you actually had to be extremely smart to run a transnational, multi-billion-dollar business that's all straight cash, basically. Like, you couldn't be a dummy doing that. So you bring up a really interesting point there of like, maybe the guys that are the low-level, like street guys, maybe they're not the smartest guys in the world, but as you get up the chain there, I imagine those are guys that if they just had picked a different path in life, they'd be still very successful.
Of course. And, but in Colombia, even rich landowners know you make more money growing coca plants than you do corn. It just, it's just the reality of the economy back in Colombia at that time. And, for Martin, he wasn't some kind of, he didn't put himself out there as like a low level dude. Like, he would play it up like, man, like, I don't take anything less than 200 keys, 500,000 keys, whatever. So these guys were hiring him to transport in one operation, $250 million worth of cocaine. And in the book, it's one of the first sort of big ops that we flesh out. The Medellin cartel calls Martin, like, we got a big shipment. We want to smuggle $250 million worth of cocaine into Miami. And we want you to do it for us. So Martin said, okay. And the way they did it was that the Colombians flew an airplane over the ocean and airdropped it into the Caribbean. And Martin, with a whole team of FBI agents who were working undercover, collected the cocaine, which were in like 100-pound bales, dozens of them floating in the sea, and they're in the ocean in the middle of the night. And no one knows that they're actually FBI agents, so they have to like actually evade law enforcement because if they get caught by the Coast Guard doesn't know that they're FBI. So there's a whole host of issues here. And they collected all the drugs and they brought it in. But it's like, you need a very special type of smuggler who can pull that off. Obviously, the FBI gave Martin a lot of the resources to complete the ruse. But Martin, as an individual, needed to be able to like actually do this and know how to do it. And in the eyes of the Colombians, there's not many people who had that sort of skill. So they trusted him with bigger deliveries and bigger deliveries. And as those deliveries started getting seized further down the line, once they're in Miami, once they're being transported to other states, the gambler's fallacy employed by the Colombians forced them to try to make up for their loss, to do a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one.
What's the gambler's fallacy?
Gambler's fallacy is that...
Which, by the way, we should set this up. You know a thing or two about cards. And
I do. Gambler's fallacy is basically like, I think of it in two ways. If you win on roulette, you think just because you just won, you're going to win again. And to some respect, if you're losing, you think, well, if I bet big and I win, everything will be okay. And that's what the Colombian cartels did. And Martin played them like a fiddle, to that end, because there was so much plausible deniability that pushed the blame away from Martin and to someone else along the chain. They always coordinated the bust so that there would be a fall guy somewhere else along the cartel's distribution network. It was never when Martin was in control of the drugs. But he always had like little things that he did that would almost sabotage or make use of the cartel's own inner workings. So it would be almost that we're them working against each other, for example. That delivery, the $250 million delivery, Martin told them, like, look, I know this is a big delivery for you guys. I'm going to make sure it's secure. Like, I'm going to hook you guys up. When I deliver this to your guys in Miami, it's going to be secure. Martin put the bales in 55-gallon metal drums and tack welded the lids on top. So you have to use a blowtorch to open the bales or open the barrels to get to the bales. And he put them into a moving truck, like a U-Haul or something similar, and brought it to the cartel's safe house, which was like a little bit of a warehouse in South Miami. Knowing full well that the dudes who would receive this didn't have the necessary equipment to open the barrels, because he had taken notes on how they did their drop off, pickup, breakdown, repackage, yada yada. So he's like, okay, I'm going to screw them a little bit. So then the dudes who are supposed to be unloading the stuff had to call their bosses, and then everyone has to come down to the warehouse and figure out how to get past this problem. What does that give the FBI? Instead of 6 mid-level, low-level dudes, packers, now they got 25. They got a whole cell that they can just raid. So they did things like that.
That's amazing. Chess, not checkers, right? Like that. It just sounds 100%. Like he was thinking 2, 3, 4 moves
And that's
ahead.
why, like, when Martin told me these stories, and as I was coming to truly understand what it meant to work a long-term covert operation, that's what it meant. Like, like people say, I worked undercover. This was like a gripe Martin had about law enforcement in some way. I worked undercover. It's like, dude, like throwing on a black hoodie and like doing like a buy bust on the street corner for a 20 bag ain't working undercover. Working undercover is doing a magic trick for someone who doesn't know they're on a stage. Martin bent the reality of these people to the point where they had convinced themselves that Martin was one of them. It was to that point. It's like, and it wasn't, and also too, the FBI made sure that it wasn't like, okay, Martin, do one delivery with these guys, then we got him, then we're going to arrest him. That took 2 months. That was easy. No. He did 1 delivery. He did 2. He did 3. He did 10. He did 20. Because the FBI wanted to gather intelligence. In some ways, these undercover operations were less about busting people or indictments. They were, and they did get there, and all these dudes got indicted and they all went to jail and their networks were broken up. But what the FBI and what the White House and what all these people figured out by 1988 is that we don't know shit about what the cartels are doing. We don't know how they're doing it. We don't know how what their methodologies are, how they think about these things. We need someone to be on the inside so we can gather that intelligence and use that as a foundation for future cases.
Well, it says a lot about where the FBI leadership and even let's call it national leadership was at that point, to be able to have the sort of tactical patience to say, hey, we're not going to just score quick wins. Because that's a lot of times you'll run into this. So those sort of like mid-level leaders in places like the FBI or CIA or other places where they'll want to get the win now or this year sort of thing. And the patience to be able to put a guy out there. And by the way, these operations, I'm sure you could speak to this a little bit, they're not cheap to run for a place like the FBI. These are expensive operations to run.
The cool thing is that since Martin, Manny, was so good at being a smuggler, he would charge the cartel millions of dollars to move this shit. And then they would just fund the operation with the cartel's money.
So smart. So smart.
So
that
free.
answers the question, right? Of like, well, what do you do with the money that you seize? Oh, you keep funding undercover operations. You make it work against the guys that earned it. That's amazing.
Yeah. So they use the cartel's money to fund the operations against them. But to your point, it was like there were a lot of smart people in the FBI at that time. A lot of the SACs in Miami, in all the other big cities, a lot of the national coordinators in DC, people at DOJ, like they understood that this was the way forward. And they, at least compared to today, so I'm told, the leash for undercover operations back then, especially for Martin, was really quite long. They did stuff back then that you would never get to do today. Airdrops in the Caribbean and shit, like no way. No way.
You hear that in a lot of different places of the government of like, oh, they used to, what they used to be able to do before. I mean, they were writing the playbook back then. This was before the, too many of the lawyers and like the people that wanted to put their brand or their rules on there. Too many things went wrong, to where the bureaucracy eventually gets a hold of any process, right? Martin was doing this at a time where, like you said, he was the first to do it. Like he's writing the book on it.
Yeah, he was the first to do it. And
who's going to tell him no?
And the thing was, too, is that Martin quickly realized that evidence collected undercover is nearly unimpeachable in court. So when they were getting convictions based on this stuff, they didn't give a shit. They're like, these dudes are implicating themselves on the wire. We have video of their plane. Like, how can you skirt around this, and I think that they really used that to their advantage in a similar way that early tech companies, it was like move fast and break things, right? And maybe they operated under a similar principle, but they certainly had the results to back it up. But they didn't brag about it. Like when they made these busts, they would give the credit to other agencies to make sure the cartel didn't think it was the feds that had someone inside. Like they would make sure that like the state police did a routine traffic stop, 80 miles north of Miami in some bumfuck county, Central Florida, So it was like the FBI didn't want the public credit. If anything, they didn't want the public credit. Because the less credit that they took and the less the public knew what they were doing, the safer Martin would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, speaking of safety, you open the book with a pretty harrowing scene of Martin basically being, he got in Puerto Rico by a Sicario. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for him to be, hunted by a Sicario and eventually come face to face with what would seem to most people like an inescapable situation?
So we just talked about the smuggling, right? That's like the first third of the book in terms of the operation. So Martin worked in Miami as a smuggler for a few years, 88 until 91, maybe. And he wanted to move back to Puerto Rico to be closer to his parents. And he had 2 young sons and he wanted them to be able to grow up a little bit in his hometown in San Juan. And when he transferred to Puerto Rico, he obviously had to leave the Miami cases behind. He told the squad in Miami, look, I'm transferring to the San Juan field office. But again, this is like the same sort of thing. Like San Juan is doing the same thing in Miami. We're targeting similar people. Let's just work together. I'll bounce around. Don't worry about it. Because Puerto Rico at the time was a hot spot, for shipments. They'd stop there. They'd dock there. A lot of people were using Puerto Rico as a transshipment hub, among other things. So Martin moves to Puerto Rico, and that's where kind of Act 2 of the book kind of begins structurally from a storytelling perspective. And, he gets back into the groove in Puerto Rico, and he's posing as a smuggler and blah, blah, blah. But they quickly come to understand that Puerto Rico, more so than being a transshipment hub between Colombia and Miami, is sort of the hotbed of cartel money launderers.
Really?
So what Martin was able to do is, again, use a source to get into this sort of network of money launderers who worked for the Cali Cartel, the Medellin Cartel, and most prominently, the North Coast Cartel. And we can go into a little bit more detail about who these people were. But in the context of Martin almost getting killed, the money laundering operation lasted for a little over 2 years. And it was a very demanding and very high stakes operation because the funnel, the pinch point of everyone in the cartel is the money.
Mm-hmm.
You're a Colombian cartel. You're making $1 billion a month. How you getting that money home? Can't use American dollars in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
You can't bring the money back on an airplane. Like, the volume of paper currency was so much that the cartels needed to find a way to get paid. So they had established a money laundering system, which is a little complicated, and we'll get in there. But there were people who would help the cartels do this. Martin, when he went undercover in Puerto Rico as a money launderer, began working for one of them, this man named El Toro Negro, the Black Bull. No one knew his real name. He was just a voice on the phone. And that's how Martin interacted with him. And this guy was very smart and pretty ruthless. But again, he was the fulcrum upon which the seesaw of money and drugs and power tilted, you know? Drugs would go out, money'd come back in, right? And this guy controlled it all because these money brokers, they almost take control of the delivery when it leaves Colombia. They give an IOU to the cartel because they're taking a massive fee. Because the cartel at that scale, they want their drugs to leave, and then a month later, they want to see pesos in their bank accounts. They don't want to deal with any of the transactional friction, especially when you're operating in the Medellin cartel.
Yeah.
And then this guy, as you say at the end of the book, finds out that Martin is actually an FBI agent, and he sends a Sicario to his house to kill him. And that's how we open the book, because I needed a good hook.
Yeah.
But it just so happens that this is also the climax of the book. It wasn't something that happened, you know, in the first couple months, and it was a big mistake. It was like Martin put himself out there so far to make this case that by the time the indictment was unsealed, and he's the only person not on the indictment, the powers that be knew that he was either an FBI agent, or he wasn't who he really said he was, or he was working with the feds. They didn't care. They wanted him dead. So Martin comes home from his morning run. He sits down in that chair to catch his breath, and then he hears the Sicario in the bushes. He turns around, and there's a gun pointed at his face, and he's like, how am I going to get myself out of this?
What was it like hearing Martin, like when he relayed this to you? What was it just like?
He like played it down.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, this guy made you kneel in your backyard with a revolver pointed at the back of your head. He's like, yeah. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I had him tell me this story probably 50 times because in that type of scene as a storyteller, you want the smallest details to land because that is how your brain operates in a moment of high stress. You know, like his adrenaline was such that it was like a state of hypervigilance to the point where even to this day, he could tell me all the little things. And that's what I really wanted from him. But Martin is so well trained that emotion was not necessarily part of his thought process. It was at first. And then he's in it and he has a goal.
Mm-hmm.
Either get far enough away so I can run and find a weapon, or get close enough so I can wrestle the guy and overpower him. That's it. But emotionally, it really hit him when inevitably he got some space from the guy and got into his house and he found his service pistol and he turns the corner and he sees his son's toys
Mm-hmm.
on the living room floor. And then he realized what he was really doing
Mm-hmm.
is that he was surviving for his boys. And again, we're back to that duality, you know, because a man is a multidimensional thing. Being a man is multidimensional. It's not about the cool shit you can do or the problems you can solve, but it's about how and why you do those things and what they may mean to those who you love. And in that moment, Martin knew that what I needed to do was stay alive for my family and show the cartel that they're not better than me, that I will always beat them. And of course he did.
Yeah, I can't imagine the emotions. Yeah, I bet after the fact too, once, you know, the problem at hand is solved, and then you're thinking, oh my God, there's a Sicario in my house where my kids are, where my wife is, where like, I can't imagine.
And then there's all the things beyond just the firefight, right?
Mhm.
There's all the things where it's like, how did they know? Well, did they really know?
Mhm.
There's no like clear answers here. Like even in the book we say like the FBI never fully confirmed that the cartel knew that he was an FBI agent. They certainly knew something or had some sort of hypothesis,
Mhm.
you know, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. It didn't really matter. It was unsafe for Martin and his family to stay in Puerto Rico, and they were given a safety transfer back to Miami. And that's where Martin still lives to this day,
Yeah.
you know. But at that time, it was like we're not really taking any chances. Maybe we've taken too many chances with this case. And again, by that time, the indictment was already unsealed. All these dudes were getting rounded up. El Toro Negro was never found.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So some of the guys, you know, since there was no extradition treaty with Colombia, evaded arrest. But that case too, you're talking about money laundering. It's not just one guy, you know, El Toro Negro, whoever else. I mean, the network, the apparatus required to launder drug money is vast, and the people involved are billionaires and very powerful, and they run some of the most well-known banks in the world. I mean, Martin going in and working a money laundering case at that time, before everyone understood how they did it, and to that scale, was unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
And very dangerous, because the cartels thought like, cool, seize our drugs.
Mm-hmm.
You're seizing 10% of our drugs. That's just like,
Cost of doing business.
it's like being Target and being like, we write off 5% of our annual revenue just on loss.
Yeah.
Same shit. They didn't care, but they're like, you know, but they're like, all we care about is that the cash that we do get gets routed back to us untouched.
Mm-hmm.
And back then it was mostly untouched because the banking regulations weren't up to snuff to how the cartels were doing it. And what Martin uncovered, he was the person to uncover it. All the literature about this that came from the Treasury or Customs or like FINRA or whoever, you know, any regulatory body, you know, any four-letter agency or whatever you want to call it that started sending notices out to banks and, you know, other financial institutions, all that came from this case.
Wow.
Because Martin uncovered the Black Market Peso Exchange.
Yeah. So that's one of the questions. What is the Black Market Peso Exchange?
This is how you launder money if you are a drug lord, right? You package up your cocaine. You send it to Miami, whether by ship or airplane or whatever. It gets to Miami. And your minions go out and they sell it. And they sell it for $20 bills, for $10 bills, for $1 bills, for $5 bills. Then you got a shitload of money. And it's street money. It's not nice, not stacked nice. It's just in boxes and it's a lot of money. It takes up a lot of space. So you can't move that money back to Colombia. 1. 2, you can't use American dollars in Colombia. You need pesos. 3, you can't go to a bank and say, hello, Mr. Bank, can you just give me Colombian pesos for this dirty ass money and thank you? No, you can't do that either. But you need to get the money into the financial system, ideally in the above ground financial system, because it's easier to manage. So how do you do that? You take the cash and you have what are called Smurfs. Smurfs are the lowest level of the money laundering ladder. Smurfs take cash in amounts under $9,999 and they go to banks and they swap the cash for cashier's checks. Now, why that number? Because banks are required to report cash transactions in excess of $10,000.
I was going to ask before even this question, was that regulation in place at this time, or was it as a result of the smuggling? Sounds like it was in place at that time.
It was in place. This was the Bank Secrecy Act, late 70s. Might have been a Nixon thing, I think. Which was like an anti-money laundering thing.
Yeah, I'm sure it came from some sort of mafia,
something like that.
Operation,
yeah,
right?
Some mob-related stuff, probably.
Yeah.
But for the cartels, they're like, okay, bet
Yeah.
we'll just do $9,999 every time. Like, who cares? Like,
yeah.
Okay, duh. So anyway, then you have cashier's checks, and these cashier's checks are made out to shell companies in name only. They are normally created in Panama or Aruba or a host of other Central American countries or South American countries. They don't really do anything, but when you have a company name, you can have a company bank account. So the Smurfs have their stacks of cashier's checks, and then they get given to a courier. And this courier physically brings the cashier's checks to certain banks that hold the bank accounts for these shell companies. In Martin's case, all of the bank accounts used in this scheme or this apparatus that this one money broker and this one cartel used were based in Aruba. There were some other bank accounts in other countries, but primarily they were based in Aruba at one bank that was owned by a family that allegedly did business with cartels and the Sicilian mafia and just helped launder illicit proceeds for a lot of different people. And this family was billionaires. And the courier brings the money, deposits it in the different bank accounts, right? Now the money broker, sitting on the phone, like a stockbroker almost in Colombia, he gets a call from his courier and says, all right, boss, the money's in the bank accounts. So East-West Transnational Shipment Co., LLC, in Panama has its money. So the broker picks up the phone and he calls a tire manufacturer in Italy. He says, I want to place an order. Okay. And I want these tires, these car tires, to be shipped to Colombia. All right. He pays for them in American dollars in cash. Then the tires are in his possession. They get shipped to Colombia. Along the way, sometimes to further muddy the paper trail, they stop at a free trade zone in Panama or another country, in which case the product can be repackaged, divvied up to different recipients in Colombia, and you can avoid paying taxes on it as well. Because when you enter a free trade zone, the designation of the good is changed. So then it can go into Colombia tax-free as well. And some of the products were actually smuggled in Colombia illegally, like cigarettes and stuff like that. But depending on the circumstance, a lot of time this was done above ground. And because the banks that were the custodians of the dirty money given to them through cashier's checks did not flag it as such, it could be used by the owner of that account to buy computers, washing machines, aspirin, car tires, cigarettes, whatever. The money broker placed an order for the goods, and we're talking millions of dollars worth of goods. Those goods would then make their way to Colombia. They are sold in the above ground market or the gray market, maybe for a little bit cheaper than full retail. And they would enter the above ground Colombian economy. And they were purchased in pesos. And those pesos, instead of going to, Transatlantic Shipment LLC, go into the cartel's bank accounts in Colombia. And the cartel has their money. And regular Colombian citizens now have access to all this cool stuff. Brand new washing machines, aspirin, car tires. The above ground Colombian economy was being supported, and in some ways probably still is, supported by laundered drug money.
What do you know what percentage of, whether it's Colombia's GDP or even like the world GDP is laundered money? I've heard figures like 3-4% before. Does that sound about right from some of the research that you've done? Because I know it's not an insignificant amount. That laundered money is making the wheels turn for a lot of places.
Yeah, it's trillions, and like you'll never stop it.
Yeah.
But when I talked to Martin about this, because I wanted to understand the sort of financial implication of this system, because in the book, we learn about the Black Market Peso Exchange as Martin does. It's a drip, drip, drip type of thing. I don't come out as the narrator and say, this is how this works. He learns it in real time. So you kind of understand the scope and scale of this. But certainly, as it was explained to him by cartel guys, if the cartel, if they didn't use this system to launder money, which is done through above ground manufactured goods, if they didn't use that system and that stuff didn't get into the Colombian economy, or even if they didn't do the whole drug thing, the economy would collapse. And the more that they laundered and the more gray market or black market goods that entered the Colombian economy, they are muscling out truly clean, white-hatted, above ground, purveyors and import-export people. Like the economy becomes even more over time reliant on the cartel's money laundering machine because it is propping up the economy. It becomes its import-export business, Not to say that the whole country is beholden to that, but again, over time, it becomes more and more and more. But to your point, yeah, I mean, the global narco trade is like trillions of dollars. All that money has to be laundered. It's getting laundered in one way or another. And the Black Market Peso Exchange was, and likely still is, the most effective way to wash dirty money.
Wow. Again, these guys can't be dummies to be coming up with this stuff. This is
Pablo Escobar's main accountant, Franklin Guajardo, went to Harvard.
Yeah.
These people aren't stupid.
Yeah.
They are, as you mentioned, they are running these businesses as if they're a publicly traded Fortune 500 company. And you have to give them credit in some ways, because to invent a money laundering apparatus like the Black Market Peso Exchange takes a lot of ingenuity and a lot of foresight. And it's just like, especially back then, like the amount of money that even the money launderers would make is just remarkable. Remarkable. They're making 12%. The spread that they make against the traditional peso value versus the dollar, the spread they made, like cartels would pay it. They're making 12 to 18% of a given cocaine shipment's street value. You bring in $250 million worth of cocaine a month, at least 25 million of that is going to your black market peso broker, who is going to make sure that pesos get into your bank account.
We're talking generational wealth if you're doing that for a couple of years. Like this is serious.
And I think a lot of the money launderers for the cartels back then, and the people that Martin had interacted with, they weren't maybe necessarily doing this as a lifelong thing. his source, a man named Tony, they kind of become like a buddy cop sort of thing, like the undercover agent, his source. Tony was a legitimate accountant for many years. But it's like, you're not making enough money and the shit's right here and it's so easy. And it's like, I just need to use the same skills I have. And if I could do this for 5 years, I could make 50 million and then just dip.
Yep.
And a lot of the guys, like, that is that sort of mindset when the people, especially from poorer countries who get into the game, it's like, but then you get caught in the game and you really can't escape it. And that's, inevitably you get caught, and you have to, make a choice. Tony made a choice. I'm going to work with Martin, and throughout the whole book, it's the Tony and Martin show. They're driving around, they're meeting drug lords, they're picking up money, they're, they're smurfing it, they're doing the whole thing, and they're trying to keep the intelligence gathering going. Tony's prodding his bosses, and, Manny will go, Manny is Martin's undercover alter ego. Manny will go and do that and meet with that person. And, so it was like, being able to see the humanity in some of the bad guys was always one of Martin's greatest strengths too, because it built trust.
You have to have an incredible capacity for empathy to do this in order just to pull off the act of you're acting to a certain degree, right? Because he's not actually Manny like that. Like you said, Manny's like an alter ego for him. You have to act, and any great actor will tell you, like, you have to have a capacity for empathy.
Well, the irony of that is that FBI agents and law enforcement in general are trained to dislike criminals. Martin, growing up in Puerto Rico in the 1970s, kind of having those street smarts, understood that people are three-dimensional, and that there are many ways to interact with someone where you both get what you want, instead of just trying to, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail type of thing. And cops are just trained like that. You are in a position of power. Everyone is subordinate to you. This is your mission. Don't let anything get in the way of it, especially emotions. Martin didn't really do that. Martin saw his sources as people who would guide him to the ultimate goal, which was making and closing the biggest cases in FBI's history. And for me, and the way that he put it to me, that was more revelatory than some of the other kind of more theatrical things. It was the sort of philosophical approach to working undercover and understanding that this job and the role that he embodied is part psychologist, part therapist, part law enforcement officer, like you said, chess, not checkers. And a lot of heart has to go into winning a game of chess. So for Martin, like, treating these people as real people always got the best results.
Well, was there anything, I mean, so much of this just sounds incredible, unbelievable, right? Like, when you're hearing these stories from Martin and you're doing this, I mean, I don't know how familiar you were with this world before you started writing this, but was there anything, as he's telling you so many stories, that just seemed like, that's unbelievable? Like, we're like, I need to go actually like fact check that or something. Like, was there anything that just, so much of this just sounds crazy? I'm not saying Martin's not a trustworthy guy or anything like that, but just as the guy that has to write these stories, like, is there anything that just blew you away like that?
Well, yeah, certainly the smuggling stories, because of the theatrics required to pull them off. I mean, they created an airstrip in Puerto Rico that was an FBI asset. Like, the airstrip was the asset, and the Colombians, were supposed to land their airplanes there. And that was going to, like, deepen Martin's cover. I think so much of what he told me, because it had never been done before and hasn't been done since, seemed remarkable because it was singular, at that place and time.
Lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
Just...
The one thing I was most worried about is that memory can be malleable. So I would have him tell me stories again 5-10 times, and I would make sure that the chronology was correct, and that you weren't mixing up scenarios through memory. But we did have some documents, thankfully, that were filed in court, in the 90s and things like that. So we did have some records that kept our chronology in check and kept numbers in check. I picked up, $1.2 million from this person. You check the court record. Oh, okay, it actually was that. No, actually, that was the other guy. This guy was 800 grand. Stuff like that we were able to do the best we could.
In some regard, I'm sure it helped that this was so far in the past that there's nothing that the FBI... I'm sure the FBI was a little bit easier to work with on the... I know this book went through a pre-publication review process and all that. I assume maybe a little bit easier since this is 30 years ago you're talking. Yeah, maybe some tactics have evolved and they're not as worried about them being disclosed.
And there's no way they're digging up the case file, out of the basement or something.
Did you have to FOIA for anything, or were they pretty cooperative? Or
I tried to FOIA for some stuff, but it just didn't come in time. I still haven't gotten it. But the pre-pub review really was pretty straightforward. They were more concerned with protecting sources. Some of these people are still alive.
Gotcha.
So I had to remove some identifying details about some people that were anonymous sources that no one ever found out that they worked with the feds. So if they did find out today, they could be killed.
Yeah.
In the same way that Martin or I could be killed.
Yeah.
By these cartel people. They're still out there.
Yeah.
And if they read this book and it brings up bad memories, who knows what they're capable of. But we're willing to take that risk for ourselves. I don't think anything's going to happen.
Yeah.
But for people who have lived with this secret of working with the FBI, who were ingratiated into the cartel for their whole lives, and they helped the feds in the 90s, they don't want that getting out. And the FBI was very cognizant of that.
Yeah.
So when they read the book,
rightly so,
they were like, all right, we don't tradecraft. We took a lot of tradecraft out already, or made it sort of, vague.
Yeah.
Because Martin was like, they're still using this sort of thing. And a lot of the assets that he developed with the cartel's money were still being used in the 2000s, and maybe even after he had retired, they would seize yachts and stuff, and just things that just became part of the Rolodex of the kind of the undercover toy chest almost. So we had to be careful about what we revealed, because we didn't want to say this is an FBI asset and then maybe they're still using it today.
Yeah.
So we went through and kind of preempted, I think, some concerns that pre-pub would have, but it was really just, source protection.
Yeah. I've found that as well, where if you're making the good faith effort, and the person that you're working with, Martin in this case, is clearly I'm not trying to put anybody in danger or render any tactics obsolete or anything, and you're making that good faith effort, I always find on the other side they're a little bit more willing to work with you on things, because they know that you're not trying to you're telling a very human story here. This isn't necessarily an expose. This is Martin's story. This is a very human experience that he went through, a very unique human experience. You're not necessarily trying to.
And they loved it because it makes the FBI look really fucking good. Because you can't not read this book and think, damn, these people were smart. And at the end of the book, Louis Freeh, one of the most legendary FBI directors, at least the most well-known, one of the most well-known, congratulates Martin, and he's like, you guys did the best. It's like the FBI wants this story told because it shows how far they went to try to win the war on drugs back in the 80s. But certainly, they have to cross the T's and dot the I's and all that.
Yeah.
But they were cool about it, and they were really complimentary. Because it's a mid-level lawyer who reads the book, but they would always give some personal notes, oh, this one was really great. Thanks so much for telling your story. And the family stuff too, they really loved. And that was a huge thing for me coming into this, is I said to Martin, we have stakes with your story, clearly. But what's at stake for you as a man? That's how we chose these cases. That's how we chose to focus on 1988 to 1994, because his sons were growing up. They went from toddlers to preteens, and Martin's away from home more and more and more and more. And danger's creeping closer and closer to their doorstep. And his father, Martin's father, is getting older, and he wants to make his dad proud, but he can't tell him what he's doing because he's working UC.
Yeah.
So it's like a lot of these sorts of emotions in terms of purpose and duty are very apparent in this story because it was all happening all at the same time for him. And I wanted that to come through. So if you read the book, you'll see like his wife Maria is in like the first 5 pages because he has to call her and say, honey, sorry, I can't come home tonight. And the family is its own narrative arc throughout the book that has its own beginning, middle, and end and rising action, because these people are tethered to Martin and him to them, and they have their own roles in the law enforcement side. Martin and his wife Maria are walking down the beach one day, and from behind them they hear, Manny, is that you? They turn around, it's a cartel guy, and Martin's with his wife, and his wife Maria just has to stay quiet and nod and smile, and she knows the guy's Colombian because of his accent, but Martin can't tell her the full scope as to what he's doing. He just told her at the beginning, like, if we ever run into anyone in public, just be cool.
Yeah.
Maria's the real unsung hero of this whole book, of Martin's career in general, because without her support, he would never have been able to do what he did. Without her silence at home, her restraint, Martin couldn't have been clear-headed in the field. He credits his ability to do this job with Maria's strength as a mother and a wife, because when he was out in the field, he knew that everything was good at home. And when he went home, she never brought him down with complaints. She always believed in the nobility of his job to a degree that allowed him to bring a level of confidence into the field that allowed him to succeed and never slip up. So that's another thing about the book. And then, you think maybe as you read the book, okay, you're just throwing in the family thing for to tug the heartstring. But then in Act 3, you have people coming to their house, sitting outside their house, pointing a gun at Martin, telling the family on Christmas Eve, we're going to fucking kill you. Who are these people? Are these cartel guys? Like this case literally brought the cartel to Martin's doorstep more than once. His wife and kids were in danger, and he had to find a way out. He had to find a way to close the case, not get killed, not get his family killed, and make his dad proud. And he was able to do all of that in this book. And then again, at the end of the book, the denouement, it all kind of comes together in that Martin's father passes away. And this was the last case that he did before his dad passed away. But he was able to tell his dad all the secrets, before he passed, and say, wow, Dad, I did this all for you, and the whole thing, And when Martin and I talked about his father, Martin cried. And that's when I knew what this book was really going to be about.
Yeah.
And Martin was apologizing to me, I don't know why I'm getting emotional. I'm like, because you've never told anyone this in your entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who's ever had a relationship with their dad, gets that emotion. There's, I think it's a unique bond that sons have with their fathers, daughters with their mothers. That's unique to the overall dynamic of a family. And it's different for everybody. Everybody's got their own unique experience and everything like that. But I don't know. I identify with it.
I mean, but for Martin too, like him and his dad used to watch TV when he was really young, and they would watch all the old school like 1950s shows, FBI agents and the naval officers, and Martin's dad would tell him, if I could do it all over, I'd be an FBI agent, I wish I could have been a naval officer. And then you look at what Martin did with his life.
Yeah.
And it's like, come on, it's like a tale as old as time. He was allowing his father to achieve his own dreams through him.
Yeah. I that hits home for me. You know, like I said at the beginning here, like my dad died of ALS, and you know, I was having some early successes, and it was like it felt like a rush to try to do as much as you could before he passed away and all that. And then yeah, when you think back on it, it gets a little bit emotional, you know. And I just, again, this is a very human story that you're telling here. It's not Miami Vice, you know. It's relationships and how messy it can be when you do a job like what Martin did. I think most people, when they think about it, and this is why stories about undercover agents are so compelling, because most people are like, I can't imagine doing something like that, or putting my family in that position, or putting myself in that position, because, you know, what we see on the news and sort of in movies and TVs and stuff is, especially with the cartels, it's like beheadings and just cruel behavior, and the stakes so high. Yeah, the payoff high, but the stakes so high, and most people can't imagine doing something like that. And with Martin, what you've done in this book is you've shown a person that is a relatable person who loves his wife, loves his kids, is a family man, but is doing this incredible thing for really a higher calling.
Yeah, and Martin really did have that higher calling, and I think that maybe there was maybe he was a little bit naive, and he admitted this. He's like, I'm doing this work. I'm doing shit that no one had ever done before. We are making some of the biggest cases in FBI history. And look, the war on drugs ain't going to win. We ain't going to win this. So for him, he never really let that sort of creeping futility kind of affect his dedication. And he was very open about that. But he came away from the experience with a very honest understanding of like how big that problem was and how big it still is today.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of drugs being consumed and cultivated and shipped around the world is like, it's going up.
The UN actually says the global cocaine output hit record highs in 2023, with Colombia's potential production up 53%. That's in 2023. I think those are the most recent statistics anyways that I could find. Yeah. So like you said, the cartels aren't going away. The drug trade is not going away necessarily. Know a little bit about participating in what is ultimately a futile war. You know, I guess that's one of the things that I was wondering is, you know, for Martin, was it all worth it? And it sounds like he found his own, certainly he had his successes. He was the most successful undercover agent in FBI history. Certainly he had his own personal successes, but I mean, did he let the fact that he ultimately knew that, hey, the cartels are not going to cease to exist, that it's ultimately a game of whack-a-mole that you're playing. I mean, did that ever get to him at all, or does it bother him at all, or is he happy with what he was able to do?
I think he's happy with what he was able to do because he came to understand that he alone as an individual can't solve that big problem. I say in the book, like, he could have thrown his identity away as Martin and become Manny and dedicated his entire life, and he still would have been scratching the surface. But to him, what he's most proud of, I think, is creating, refining, and implementing new techniques that made the FBI as an institution better at its job. And I think that's what he's most proud of. And being able to take what he learned on the fly and teach it to young agents who may be able to use it to enhance the success of their own cases. And for him, that is kind of the legacy that he left behind. Some people might not remember this case, right? But they'll remember Martin as the coordinator, in the late 2000s, where he was coordinating covert operations. He was backstopping agents, which means he was making sure that their alter egos and their legends were airtight. And he was using assets that he had been cultivating for years and decades. Because when you go undercover, the story is everything. And as technology gets better, the story has to be better because it's easier to find out if you're lying. So the assets that he would use, clothes, cars, whatever, bank accounts especially, and there are other ways to create a new identity with social security numbers and different types of records. I mean, Martin was able to cultivate these things over a long period of time. So say it's 1995 and you're a drug lord and you have a Swiss bank account. That bank account stays active for 20 years. When you use it in an operation for another agent in 2015, you could check that bank account out and you'll never find out that it was created by the FBI. Stuff like that.
Yeah, and I imagine too, if we're thinking about, because you wonder like, oh, how feasible would something like this be today with the technology and people's history of social media posts and stuff? I mean, I don't have any insider knowledge here, but I'd almost guarantee
I don't either, but it'd be hard as hell.
Yeah, and we already know that places like Meta and Twitter and other places have worked with the government in multiple different capacities. I would not be surprised if institutions like the FBI have a relationship with a place like Meta to make sure that, hey, their guy that they're going to send undercover has Facebook profile posts going back to when they were a teenager. If you're somebody our age today, to make sure that they have a social media presence that goes back and a web presence that goes back, I have to believe that they're working with the big tech companies.
Oh, they have to be. I mean, I don't have any insider knowledge, but it just seems obvious that you would need that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
If you came into any type of like criminal subculture and you had zero online presence,
that's weird, right? Like,
it's just fucking weird.
Yeah,
it's
just
just
not
weird.
you can't just forge a birth certificate these days and call it good. Like, it's not that it was ever so simple, but it was certainly before the sort of information era and everybody being so online. Certainly there was less steps probably. Now, you need not just a birth certificate, not just friends that you grew up with to corroborate your story, but like this entire online presence.
But back in the day, like the cartel would vet you by tracing the VIN numbers on your car, boat numbers, plane numbers. They would go back, ownership, history, who owned it before you, who owned it before them. Sometimes they would ask for your social security number, that sort of thing. But it's kind of funny because the higher up in the cartel you go, the more of a faux pas it is to ask probing questions. So you get up really high in the cartel, they don't ask your last name. They don't ask any of that shit, because it's like, you're up here talking to me because you've already been vetted to some capacity.
Yeah.
So Martin was able to kind of like jump a couple rungs on the ladder by getting some really great sources to introduce him without having to go through that sort of rigmarole where some stupid administrative error could blow cover. So it was like, there was like unwritten rules, like business rules. It was like, you show up to a meeting with a bag, you never, like, the other person never asks to see your bag. No one ever like touches you and like, wants to make sure, like, it's all like, we're businessmen. Like, we don't play that shit,
Yeah.
which helped him tremendously.
I was surprised on the sort of the security element of that, how much he actually wore a wire. It seems kind of crazy. That's one thing that I've heard Joe Pistone say before about how he almost never wore a wire because he was like, oh, that'd be a dead giveaway if I ever got searched or something like that. I'd be dead. For Martin, it seemed like he wore a wire a lot. He had a lot of surveillance. I mean, we've got pictures like this and things like that. Was that a concern for him, or? So
by the time, and I think a lot of this was learned by Pistone, because he was the only one to really do something deep undercover where you're kind of getting into RICO territory where you want to take down an organization. You need unimpeachable evidence.
Yep.
These people are rich enough to hire the best lawyers and they'll dance around you in court and then you're fucked.
Yeah.
So when Martin's going UC, it really was imperative for them to have robust surveillance, if possible, video and photo surveillance, but that Martin would be able to wear a wire because you can't prove conspiracy without intent. And there's so much circumstantial bullshit that goes into plausible deniability when it comes to these sorts of people. They're not handling drugs. They don't have them in their backpack. It's like so much of this is like you have the layers and layers of the onion in terms of how these drug organization works. But if they talk to you about it and they admit what they're doing and they prove intent through their words, then you're set. Now, thankfully, back in the day, in Hispanic culture, men would have satchels. It was like a fashion thing. especially when you were in the kind of the higher end groups, men would carry things in a satchel, a gun, personal items. It was very common for people to wear satchels. So Martin never wore the wire.
Mm-hmm.
He just put it in a satchel because the fashion back then was unbuttoned shirts,
Mm-hmm.
and like the kind of like late 80s sort of Caribbean flair. But thankfully, everyone carried bags. So Martin would just stick the recorder in his bag, and they also bugged all of his cars and his boats really well. So if anyone went in the car with him, it was recorded. But if you went to a meeting at a restaurant, he'd just take the bag off, put it on the table, just like it was a normal meal.
Mm-hmm.
And they would record everything. And that's it. Because the customs for these types of people were to not disrespect your guest or your business partner. You weren't going to search their bags. It's not like going into a trap house
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, you have to be searched before you enter. Like the customs were so different, which gave leeway for, operational tradecraft that, Martin said he almost always put it in unless he had a bad feeling about it, which in the book we do talk about one time where he's like, I don't like how they changed the meeting place. I don't like the neighborhood they're bringing me to. I feel like I've been pawned off to some deputy I've never met.
Mm-hmm.
He's not the real boss of this crew. Like, I don't want to bring the wire. There's some risk here.
So that's interesting. He's evaluating the sort of impact of what he's going to do, or the ROI, right? And against the risk with that. How often did he have to do that when he was making sort of operational decisions where he's kind of weighing that risk versus impact? Is this juice worth the squeeze? Is
All
the
the
ROI
time.
there for the investigation?
He was doing it all the time, and so much of it was perhaps small incremental changes. I think choosing not to wear a wire to a meeting feels a little bigger and more deliberate, which in a certain respect it could be because it is a dead giveaway that you are a cop.
Yep.
But like I said, like tack welding the barrels, that type of thing is similar in that this is a sort of a little bit of an operational pivot that can give you the upper hand or pull some risk off of you a little bit.
Yeah.
And he was doing that all the time, depending on who he was conversing with, depending on the circumstance. It's like sometimes you have to be able to use the person's, own behavior against them, in that Martin figured out pretty early that if he was on the offensive a lot of the time, put them on their heels, make them come up with an excuse, he could get out of the situation. Versus always being on the defensive. I didn't do anything wrong. Like, don't be mad at me. He would be like, these are your people. Why are they getting caught? I have a great thing going for me. I don't want to work with you anymore. What if I get arrested?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you guys got heat on you. Like, I'm out of here. Like, don't call me anymore. He would do that all the time.
That makes sense. I mean, through all of this too, I suppose that allows him his ability to be able to sort of deny certain things or turn down certain opportunities. Probably helps him keep some sort of a moral North Star too on things that he maybe not for operational reasons, but just personal reasons doesn't want to be involved with. And I think I'm kind of interested in that as well. For anybody that goes undercover, there's got to be this struggle between what I need to do to play my character, to do this investigation, and also keep my, not just sanity, but my moral center. How did Martin navigate that?
Yes, Martin did have a moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
And not only moral for him personally, but for the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an undercover FBI agent, you can't be like doing lines of coke with your cartel bros. So Martin, again, looked for advantages through customs. A lot of these higher end cartel guys, it was a little bit kind of cringe to like be doing coke in front of each other for whatever reason. A lot of them would get up and they'd excuse themselves. They go to the bathroom. They go to a private room. Maybe in some situations they would do it together, but not really with the guys he was doing business with. And some of the guys weren't really even doing drugs. Mm-hmm. Not everyone was doing the drugs, mainly because they're so high end, in the organization, they have to keep their kind of wits about them. So if someone ever was like, here, please have some, and they were doing it in like a way where it's like, I'm being generous, you must accept, he would Martin be like, yeah, sure, thank you. He'd take it, go to the bathroom, stand there for 5 minutes, and just go back and give the guy the bag,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and just fake it. And then cartel guys are more like drinkers and like womanizers,
Yeah.
right? So with the drinking thing, a problem with the cases was that if Martin was ever intoxicated or plied his target with alcohol to the point where they were overly intoxicated, it could be a prosecutorial problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's ways to be like, well, your agent got my client drunk and he said things that weren't true because he was drunk. You don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want Martin as the agent on the wire slurring, blah, blah, blah. That could be like a reputational hit to the agency. So Martin really kept, although he drank a lot with these guys because it's custom to have whiskey together. It's like celebratory. He would always really kind of have himself in check in that regard. And then with the women, that was like a huge thing for Martin. Like he doesn't want to like be forced to like, have to smooch on or like, have sex with like random Colombian cartel girls. So to circumvent this in any sort of like kind of more fun social situation that wasn't a straight up business meeting, the FBI would have a female agent accompany him as his girlfriend to help protect his personal life, which was kind of funny. I think one of the agents, she might have actually gone undercover as well later because she was like kind of so psyched on being able to go with Martin into these situations. But the female agents were like kind of a secret weapon. Sometimes they would, manufacture, parties on yachts and the whole yacht was bugged. But the female agents would go around and they would listen. Pretty easy for them to listen and to grab intelligence and then pass it along and stuff like that. So they definitely used that to their advantage. One, to keep Martin's moral compass in check, but to enhance his story and also to further the case.
By the way, the female undercover FBI agents that have to go in and do that, I want to read that book, Ian. So like, I don't know if you're taking submissions right now. That sounds like an amazing story in its own right. But, I want to think a little bit bigger picture of this. More recently in the news, there's a lot of things going on the southern border. Immigration, refugees, gang members, cartels, all of them, everything from MS-13 to Colombian cartels, they're all being talked about. They're kind of in the American zeitgeist right now because of the different actions that are being taken by the current administration. In addition to that, I mean, cartels were recently relabeled as terrorist organizations, which opens up a slew of military options that can potentially be taken against them. All of that being said, one of the things that I think has helped their survival is their ability to infiltrate at the very highest levels of government, of banks, of businesses. How compromised are politicians, bankers, and et cetera in this country right now by the cartel, do you think?
The cartels, beginning in the late 70s in Colombia, were really able to amass power by having friends in high places. It's just part of the rule book, right? And unfortunately, that rule book has sustained for decades. During Martin's operation, he helped trace, and this was a public scandal, but that, cartel drug money finds its way into presidential elections in Colombia all the time. And a lot of these candidates, maybe they don't overtly take the suitcase in the hotel room, but they might know it's there and they don't say anything about it. And in Martin's case, it was pretty curious that the president of Colombia at the time, Ernesto Samper, allegedly received drug money into his campaign, and there were like audio tapes and like it was a whole thing, and like all this stuff came out and he denied it, and then it was kind of like, well, maybe it was in there, but I didn't know, and blah, blah, blah. But because it was coming from the Cali cartel, at the same time, the Cali cartel wanted to surrender to the Colombian government for favorable terms. How do you get your favorable terms, right? That's just an example. But you look at Mexico now, you look at a lot of different countries in Central America. I mean, the irony is that the way that these countries are able to generate income for their citizens is through illegal means. And it's like, because of that, a lot of people in power and politics can be susceptible to corruption because they potentially feel like there's no other way to really do this job, right?
Mhm.
And, like I said earlier, is that like Martin kind of felt that there was an aspect of futility in his job because to him, the war on drugs never really started. Like, to really dismantle the manufacturing, the transportation, the selling and the consuming of narcotics, it is bigger and more complicated than just Border Patrol, And the way that Martin has explained it to me from his point of view is that you have to really go out in there and think of this as like a multifaceted war. You're not going to drop bombs, in Sinaloa or something like that. But you have to really think about this in a smart way and understand how you can use guerrilla and perhaps psychological warfare to create instability, which then can make the cartels topple, right? In the same way that we try to do it with communism and all this other stuff. It's just like Martin said, okay, if Donald Trump wants to fly drones over Mexico and drop bombs, he's like, yeah, okay. But again, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail.
Mhm.
Once the cartels know your playbook, they're going to see you coming from a mile away. They're going to pivot, and then you're back to square one. He says that in order to be able to really curtail the cartel's influence is to do a multifaceted approach. You have some overt tactics, some covert tactics, some political tactics, but it requires a sustained effort.
Mhm.
And for Martin, he was like, for me, working law enforcement, I'm in the thick of it in Puerto Rico with these cartel guys, and I turn on the news, and back home, it's the 3 strikes, you go to jail forever type of stuff. It's like our priorities maybe were a little mixed up in terms of how to really solve this problem. And it's complicated, and not everyone has the right answer. I certainly don't.
It gets real messy, and obviously, the drug trade has impacted every corner of America. I don't think I've ever met anybody here that hasn't been personally affected by a family member or friend that has gone down that path and been negatively affected. I mean, and yeah, on the legislation side, I think it's led to, the legislation around what's illegal, what's not illegal has led to the mass incarceration of Americans of a lot of different stripes. I saw one interview just floating around social media the other day with a guy that has 58 felonies. He's in prison for a long time. He's like, most of them were simple possession, like simple possession, not even intent to distribute or anything like that. And it's like, so we've got a little bit of a problem to address on multiple fronts. This is not a simple thing. And I think this book is going to leave people with a lot of questions too, just because this book is coming out at the right time. It really is.
I think so too, and I asked Martin about Trump, Trump wants to wage war on the cartels. That's what he said. And Martin said, he's correct, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the thing about the war on drugs and about what Martin tried to do, is that you're doing the right thing. You're winning, sort of.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the big picture takeaway that has presence today, in that the war on drugs is a quagmire. It is squishy. It is multi-pronged. But there are ways to make a measurable impact.
Mm-hmm.
They're difficult. They come along maybe once in a generation, because sometimes what you really need to make a dent is one guy who's willing to go undercover and become one of them. Martin was the first.
Yeah.
He's been the only one to do it. But I am confident maybe there's another young guy out there who might read this book and say, maybe I could do that too.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the time today, Ian. I really appreciate it. And the book is Inside the Cartel by Martin Suarez and Ian Frisch. It is out today. We're recording this episode a little bit ahead of time, but by the time our listeners, our viewers are watching this, they'll be able to go right out to the bookstore if they want to, or order online, whatever it is. It's a fantastic book. Again, I'm hoping that there's some merch along with this. I want to wear this t-shirt, you know? Yeah, please pass along my best to Martin.
I will.
And I can't wait for the world to hear his story.
All right, me too. Thanks.
Awesome.